Why do so many book sequels suck? No, I mean it. I'm not trolling here. I'm genuinely asking why do so many sequels to famous debut novels fall flat on their face after having such a strong starting off point? Especially if you look at the literary world as a whole. I mean, there are plenty of amazing sequels to books out there, like this one, and this one, and that one, and no, not you, or you, and definitely not you. So, a lot of sequels are bad, and this isn't just a book problem either, it's in all media really. And some of it makes sense, especially if you look at storytelling purely as a business. If a movie studio makes a buttload of money off a movie, well, then they want to keep that hype train going and pump out a sequel as fast as possible. And the fastest way to do that is to more or less copy and paste the plot of the first movie, write in a new location or a new character, and Bob's your uncle, money time. Only a lot of times the higher ups at the studio don't understand what made the original movie popular in the first place, and the second movie has a dramatic diminish in its returns. But that tends to happen more when a piece of art gets made by a committee whose only goal is to make money. It doesn't explain why the sequel to a book series, which is usually written by a single person, has the same outcome. The most obvious explanation can be found in the act of writing a book itself. See, when you're first starting off as a writer, you're still finding your own narrative voice, the distinct style you like to write in, and more importantly, write well in. Most of the time, when a writer is first starting off, they tend to imitate the writers they already know and love. After this initial stage, certain things, experiences, or even characters start to accumulate in their mind. See, no one book is a single idea or concept. It tends to be this big gumbo soup of a bunch of little ideas put together. A writer can come up with a really cool concept like, say a boy is secretly a wizard and gets to go to magic school, but they're going to need a lot more than that to make a good story. This can also be a fairly long process as well, especially for new writers. They tend to store the cooler, more unique concepts or ideas in the back of their head to be used later on when they have something else that can go with it. Not to mention that it's also going to take a while for the writer to hone and sharpen their craft to the point where it's good enough for a literary agent to think it's publishable. Remember, a cool concept or story idea is great, but a good book it does not make. So what ends up happening is that a writer has these great ideas marinating in their gray matter for a few years, waiting for their skills to catch up, and then finally, boom, they write a bestseller. But what happens next? Well, what happens next is that the publisher wants a sequel and they want it as soon as possible, ideally within a year of the first book's publication. The only problem is that the writer had 5 years working on the first book's settings, plots, character arcs, not to mention the fact that they didn't know that they were going to need to write a sequel at all because who writes a sequel to a book that hasn't even been picked up yet? And they've used all their really cool ideas on the first book. So now the writer finds themselves in a situation where they have less time to write, fewer ideas, and not to mention a comfortable amount of money in the form of their advance, so their drive to survive off of their art is a little more satiated. So what ends up happening is that a lackluster second novel is produced and everyone's just a little sadder. Another reason the second book in a series can be bad has to do with the act of writing an entire series itself, as opposed to one really good novel. See, when writing an overarching series, the two main parts that get the most attention from the writer are the beginning and the climactic ending. A writer can come up with a really cool concept, characters, and picture how their adventure eventually ends, but it's that middle part where things get tricky. Keeping your reader engaged in the middle of the story is easily the hardest part of writing, and it's even harder when you have to break up that story into several large books. It's why the best stories have rising action in the middle. If a story fails to have rising action, then it means the story doesn't really escalate, stays flat, and you lose your audience. Plus, there are inherent boundaries in the very concept of a middle book in a trilogy. You can't kill off the big bad of the series because then the final book would just be an anticlimactic mess, and you can't kill off the main protagonist because who's gonna kill the main bad guy in the finale? Most of the time, what ends up happening is that the main hero goes on a fetch quest for the one thing that can stop the big bad guy, where along the way, they either kill the big bad guy's second in command, or the hero's second in command gets killed, or both, if you're nasty. The point being, the main conflict of the overall story doesn't get resolved, and the whole thing becomes little more than a setup/advertisement for the next book. And this isn't a strictly trilogy problem either. This happens to nearly every famous second to last book in a long-running series. Take a look at Harry Potter, for instance. If you ask any average fan what happens in The Half-Blood Prince, most people will point out the one, maybe two big things that happen within the book. We find out what Horcruxes are, and Snape kills Dumbledore. That's about it as far as important information is portrayed in this book. Everything else is fairly inconsequential to the overall story. Think about that. This is a 600-page book, and we only get two things that stand out in the series as a whole. And since the one lead Dumbledore has on a Horcrux turns out to be a fake, it's really one big event while learning about something that's only going to matter in the last book. And this problem isn't just a coincidence within J.K. Rowling's writing either. Brandon Sanderson, one of the greatest fantasy writers that's still kicking it above ground, has also fallen into this penultimate book lull in his latest Stormlight Archive novel, Rhythm of War. It's way too long of a series to try and explain in this video, but Rhythm of War is scheduled to be the second to last book of the first half of his Stormlight Archive series, and the problems of this book are the same as in the Half-Blood Prince. The majority of the story treads water in a single location. It expands the lore of the book's universe a bit, but not so much that it would be daunting to the audience, and has only a handful of meaningful plot events that actually matter to the series as a whole. Also, I know I sound like I'm being overly harsh on Harry Potter and the Stormlight Archive, but I just wanted to say that I really do love both of these series, and you should definitely check them out, especially Stormlight. So how can writers avoid this problem? Well, there are a few things. The first one being that they can write a series that has a more episodic approach to storytelling, where each book technically leads into the next, but the story of the previous book has little to no impact on the plot of the second book. Most detective series are like this, where the protagonist goes out, solves a crime, catches a bad guy, then returns to his slum of an office, ready for the next saucy dame to walk through their door. The other way a writer can avoid this problem is a little more complicated. Basically, it comes down to some pretty cohesive world building and a little bit of plot outlining. Before the writer starts writing a single word of their book, they would have to create a world with a variety of unique environments, rules to their magic system, a set of laws to govern the physics of the world, and a myriad of people whose histories, cultures, levels of technology have all been thoroughly thought through. The reason being is that this creates a pretty strong base to write the first book off of, with potential for more later on. Now, this amount of world building does sound like a lot, but it can be an advantage for the writer in the second book if it ends up getting published. If the writer has a familiar setting to start from, the writer can then break those rules in a massive twist the reader didn't see coming, and the rising action of the book can be how the hero deals with the breaking of these rules and adapts to grow or change as a character, possibly going through some kind of trial by fire scenario, leaving the final confrontation in the last book ready to still be explored later. Now, there's probably a ton of other ways a writer can avoid the dreaded middle book syndrome. After all, there's no one correct way to tell a story, but those are the two big ones I could think of. So in short, middle books are hard, but with proper world building and planning, you can make them stand out on their own, if not make them better than the first. Let me know in the comments down below what sequel you love to hate. Hit the likes and subscribe if you like what I do here, and as always, thanks for watching.